contrary to what Trump's propaganda is telling us, and what many people believe, foreigners aren't creating the trade deficit. Foreigners are not ripping off the United States. The trade deficit is made by Americans. Americans are spending more than the gross national product. And to make up for that difference, we have to have a trade deficit. And the trade deficit is a negative number. The spending is positive. It's greater than the positive GDP number. And to make that identity balance, you have to have a negative number. And the negative number is a trade balance.
Exactly.
So the trade deficit actually turns out to be, number one, an irrelevant policy variable that no one should be paying much attention to in the United States. And they shouldn't be making any big deal out of it, because it's actually produced by Americans, and it's good for Americans, because why? We can finance it very easily. Because what do we do? How do we finance it? We export a surplus of American assets, bonds, equities. Foreigners buy those. They send their capital in, and that's how the thing is financed. But people don't understand these basic things. They get their feet all tangled up and confused because they don't pay attention to very simple accounting identities, and don't understand really how the system works at all. So the tariffs are not going to do anything except distort trade. They will distort trade, and the sourcing for the imports that fuel the trade deficit or accommodate the trade deficit, the sourcing of that will be different depending on who gets hit harder with tariffs. If all the tariffs are lumped up on China, we'll get fewer imports from China, and we'll get more from somebody else.
I know you answered this question, but I want to sort of ask it from a different perspective, because I get many comments when I post a video about tariffs. I get many comments that say, well, tariffs will be used to bring manufacturing back. And I know you've already alluded to the root causes of why tariffs are a bad idea, but what would be your response to that comment?
It's just not going to happen. Every time a president is asked about this, recently I read an interesting post by Professor Krugman on his Substack, and Krugman explained why. Krugman, of course, is a Democrat, left of center. He's an economist, Nobel laureate, very famous economist, and he's talking about trade, which happens to be the area that he received his Nobel Prize for, and so he knows what he's talking about, and he explains essentially what I'm telling you. He explained it in a slightly different way, but the same identities. He gets into the identities, and he goes through the thing. But the interesting anecdote that he had is that when Clinton was first elected as president, some of the high priests of economics in the Democratic Party went down to Little Rock to see Clinton, and Krugman was in that group. So Clinton asked Krugman exactly the question you asked me. It was exactly the same question. And Krugman gave him exactly the right answer. He said, don't sweat it. You're not going to bring back manufacturing the way we used to have it in World War II or whatever in the distant past you want to look at. Things are changing, and things are changing just like they did with agriculture. At the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, most people worked in agriculture on farms. Now almost nobody does. But agricultural output is boomed. And how can that be? Well, it can be because agriculture is very productive. Each person working on on a farm now produces way more than somebody in 1900, or even when I was a boy working on the farms in the 1950s. Now, if you go out to Iowa, where I grew up, you can't believe. I mean, you see these huge tractors. Everything's computerized. Everything's run on GPS and everything else. I mean, it's a different world. It didn't exist when I was a boy. Or take my father. My father, who was born in 1919, of course, grew up on the farm. He would tell me stories about how they were picking corn by hand. They didn't even have a corn picker. They had horses that were drawing a wagon, and the guys were picking corn by hand. Well, by the time I got there, they had corn pickers, 4-row corn pickers, a lot more productive and so forth. Now they got 12 rows, and they're shelling corn automatically out in the field with a combine and everything, and it's all done in one shot. And by the way, my friends that I grew up with, this is very capital intensive. You don't have any people, but you've got a lot of capital, and those 12-row combines, those cost over $1 million a unit. This is big time. Right. So this is manufacturing. So how does this agricultural story come into manufacturing? Well, our manufacturing output goes up, the output goes up, the value of output goes up, but the number of workers in manufacturing goes down. Why? Because productivity goes up, automation goes up, more robots, the whole game is changing dynamically all the time.
Absolutely. And this is why it's important to have global trade that actually functions well. And there is global cooperation where things can be produced, in China or anywhere else in the world that it doesn't make sense to produce here domestically. And due to high labor cost, high input costs, regulations that we have here in place. And so those are all things that probably should be considered in the broader discussion of whether it's even possible to bring manufacturing back, and of course, whether it's even possible to bring it back using tariffs. So as you mentioned, things change, and using the same frameworks that worked 40, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, doesn't mean that we'll get the same positive results now.
Well, absolutely. And one way to think about it, people think, economists, if you read an economics book, they'll always have a phrase in there, gains from trade. Well, that can be either domestically between you and me trading something, Lena, or it can be internationally between an American and a Chinese operator. So it isn't countries, by the way, that trade with each other. It's individuals and enterprises that trade with each other. Now, what are gains from trade? Let's use a simple example. Let's say you're selling me something and I'm buying it. Now, what are the gains from trade? Well, the gains are you wouldn't sell it to me if you weren't benefiting. And I wouldn't buy it if I wasn't benefiting. So you benefit, I benefit. That's the gains from trade. Now, if the government comes in and taxes us for that trade, they put like a sales tax on us if it was domestic. If you were, a Russian or something selling me something, then we'd have a tariff. But that's the same as a sales tax. And that, what's that do? That removes some of the gains from trade between you and me, and gives that money to the government. So there are always gains from trade. Anyone trading with each other, the buyer benefits and the seller benefits. Otherwise, there'd be no trade. So there are gains. And once the government steps in between, they can do that. If it's a domestic trade, they can do it with a sales tax or an excise tax, some kind of domestic tax. Or if it's some foreign buyer and seller, then we have tariffs coming in. Or they can do other things. They could have non-tariff barriers, or they could put quotas and say, oh, Lena and Hanke, they can only trade, but in a limited number. You can freely trade 10 units, but if you go to 11, a quota kicks in and you can't do 11. That's what a quota does.